So I'm just going to go through this, tell stories, more or less, or kind of.
Who is Robert, the son of this Henry? Who's Robert Eames?
They were brothers, the three brothers came in together.
So that was Bob.
Mm-hmm. That was Bob.
Okay.
Bob and Will and Harry.
I'm like, okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of what, I guess, my mother asked us to do this because this is Tammy and I's grandmother. So the first one, and Emma Elizabeth Eames, and everyone called her Lizzie, and she was born in Weber County, and she was number one. And they talked about Lucy just when she was born. She was tiny. She only weighed 5 pounds. And her mother told that she carried her in a pillow until she could get enough strength to be out of the pillow. So, I don't know why the pillow, but that's why they packed her around. And she said she had, till she got stronger. She says she was born with blonde hair and brown eyes, and then it turned to brown. And then she says when she was in her early 50s, it was pearly white. And her dad wrote her a letter about her birth, and it says, "Lizzie, you will be 53 on Monday. My mind goes back to the time you were born. I remember that I was out putting peaches on the house to dry when I was called in a hurry to go for Sister England, the midwife. You were born all right, but things were not going well. I knew I must get a doctor in a hurry. I remember running down the road praying that all would be well." So, and she talks about, I guess she was kind of a sickly baby, but soon snapped out of it. And also they talked about, she said when she was small and her mother was standing outside of the cabin, she said as a baby, she reached her little hands up towards the moon. The moon was out there, and she reached her little hands up and was crying. And her mother said that she felt badly that she couldn't give that to her. And she talks about, she said, "I wonder how many mothers with so much love in their hearts for their children would not like to give them all they could ask for, even the moon." And then it kind of jumps around. And it says she spent 17 years writing and recording history of Raymond, Canada. And so I'll go back to that a little bit later, but she says she had a hard time writing the history about herself. She says she did this history for Canada, for Raymond, and it was okay, but once they asked her if she would do the history, write her own history, she said that, she didn't like that so much. She said she had a favorite horse that she said it ran away with her. And she said she had her hair all pinned up and the horse was running wild through the field, and she says pretty soon the hairpins had fallen out and the hair was down, and she just was. Anyway, it said that they were so thankful that she was okay. But she declared, she says, that was the most exciting ride I had ever had. So she must have had a little bit of, I don't know. She wasn't just a mild, timid lady. Yeah. And
Is this Lizzie that you're talking about?
this is Lizzie. And so when Lizzie this is the first recollection she remembered, was when she was 3 years old. And I look at my grandson, and I think he can remember. He is so smart. He can tell you anything, this little Jackson Jones. And I'm sure he knows stuff at 3 that he's going to remember for an entire life. And so she must have been really smart, because this little Jackson, my grandson, is super smart too. Her earliest recollection was she's 3 years old, and she said they were at Hot Springs in Willard, Utah, and her dad was getting on a diving board. And she says, I clung to my mother's skirt and cried because she was so afraid that when her dad was going to jump into the water. So that was her first recollection. And then her second recollection was the circus come into town, and she said she was thirsty, and her dad bought her a lemonade. And she says, I'll never forget the taste of that lemonade. She says, I must have been really, really thirsty because it was tasted so good. And then second thing she remembered about the circus was the gentleman in bright clothing riding the 2 horses around the ring. And I think she was 4 years old when she remembered that. And when she was 4, they moved to Almo, and he said, talked about father being in farming and the mercantile business with his brothers Harry and Will at the Eames Brothers store. And she says, when my brother Robert Eames was born, we had put together a 2-log room cabin by a creek. And she said her and her brother, Lonnie, she called him Alonzo, she said they had to sleep on the kitchen floor. And she had a little fetish about chicken eggs. She said when she was 6, she would go into the nesting hens and she would steal the eggs from underneath the hens. She says even though the hens were pecking her and making her hands bleed, she would take those chickens. Her dad caught her. And he says, if you do it again, you're going to get a whipping. And she said, and she'd plant them in the garden. So I don't know what this thing is. She'd go out and plant them in the garden. So
That's why the cantaloupe grew so well.
Maybe, so she'd steal these poor eggs from underneath this chicken. And she said she says she must have had a mean streak because she did it again. After her dad told her, warned her, you know, if you ever do this again. And she said she was stealing the chicken eggs, and she heard her dad coming, and she says, oh my gosh, I ran as fast as I could, slid under the fence, and she says, I was almost under the fence, and my dad grabbed my dress. And so they, she says, oh yeah, I got a spanking. And then she said, of course, my dad later that night, you know, just felt so bad for giving me a spanking. And she says, my dad gave me a second spanking. She said she was out her dad told her, gave her a note to go give an uncle. Go give the uncle that he needed some I don't know, bolts or something. Exactly on this note what he needed. So she went to go to the uncle's house and walking through the field, and pretty soon she's seen some pretty flowers. And she started picking them, and then pretty soon there was more pretty flowers, and pretty soon she set the note down, and she had a handful of flowers, and then she remembered, dang, where's the note? She remembered she was supposed to go to some uncle somebody and give him this note that her dad really wanted her to do, and she looked and looked and looked, couldn't find the note, so she went home and says, I lost the note. And guess what? She got her second whipping. He wrote the note again and sent her on her way. So she was quite the character, I think. And she said, we had the best and kindest parents in the world, yet we were disciplined when we needed it, and I'm thankful for their teaching. And when she was 8, they moved to another part of Almo, the Cove. And she said it was a pretty location near the mountains. I remember Twin Rocks. So I don't know what she was calling Twin Rocks. Anyway.
Olin, when I went with him, we went on that road around towards Erickson's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, on the other on the side of the cove, and he kind of pointed up into that area towards the
Oh.
castles,
Okay.
and there was like a little homestead you could see it, and there's an
Okay.
orchard or something, and I'm wondering if that wasn't where
Maybe.
they were.
Maybe. But wherever they moved to, she said they built a better log house, and it had 4 rooms, and she said the windows had 12 small panes of glass to a window. And she says, I remember it being very hard to wash. The kitchen had a large room, and she said she spent most of her early days doing the homemade rag carpet with straw as carpet padding, and they had that, and then they would take it to Utah to have it being wove together for the big rug in the living room. And then she said the kitchen was bare boards, and I used to scrub them boards to make them white and clean. And she was 8 years old, or 9, and she stayed with her grandfather, Alonzo, and she talked about him giving her a 3-cent piece, and it was dated 1854. And she said until she died, she kept that coin, and people asked her, why didn't you sell it? It's worth a lot of money. And she says it meant too much to her that she didn't ever want to sell it. And she had a Bible that her grandfather Knight gave me his mother's Bible dated 1843, which now is 120 years old. So that was another precious thing that she, kept and had. She said,
Juanita,
mm-hmm,
the house she was talking about with the windows,
mm-hmm.
that was at the end of the old Rocky Lane.
Oh,
From
okay.
Dan Tracy's.
Oh, up there, okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that was
Okay.
that house.
Okay. And when she was 10 or 11, they had an Indian scare just through the 1890s through 1891. So I guess a lot of the Indians were having an uprising, and her parents left to go to town to get supplies 3 miles from our house. And she was, of course, she was the oldest, and then she was in charge of the rest of the kids. And she said all of a sudden she could see somebody coming on a horse. And she just panicked, and she got all her little brothers and sisters and put him down the basement, and there was a chest down there, and put him in the chest, cover it with blankets and shoes and boxes. She says, this one I didn't smother him. And then she says, I was just so scared, and she went upstairs, and she could see this person coming, and she just knew that something awful was going to happen, and all of a sudden this person knocked 3 times. And so she kind of peeked around through the door, and it was a neighbor. And so she, ran downstairs and got the kids out of the box, and she said it was, she was so afraid. But that just was one of her memories. When she was 11, she went to a dance. And she told her mother, she says, guess who danced with me? And her mother says, who? And she says, Louis King. And she says, I think I fell in love with him, that handsome young man then, and have been in love with him ever since. So I'm surprised they're letting their little girls go to dances at 11. No wonder they were married at 14.
Yeah. How old's Gracie?
Yeah, she's older than that.
So, and she talks about she had lots of suitors. I guess she was a pretty lady. She was the organist for the Sunday school, and she remembered playing her first song, "Kind and Gracious Father." She says, I was so frightened I broke down and cried. And her father was the superintendent of the Sunday school, and he said, you're not going to be a quitter, are you? She says, I straightened up and played it over without a single mistake. And then from then on, she was the organist for the ward, Sunday school, primary, and concerts. She talks about walking through the snow 1.5 miles to go to school. Deep snow, very cold weather. And then she says, I had to work very hard when I was a girl, being the oldest in the family of 12. She says, Mother either had a young baby or going to have one. I had responsibility of huge washings and ironing, cleaning, picking fruit, churning butter, skimming pans and pans of milk, helping with the garden, emptying straw ticks and refilling them with clean, fresh straw. And she says, I helped my brothers milk the cows. In my spare time, practiced my music and knitted socks. And she was at home until she was 21 years old. And she says, it was happy years, except for one incident. She says, I hate to tell this, but she says, I want to tell it so my grandchildren or great grandchildren will learn from my mistake. And she says, I never grumbled or complained about anything, my duties, but she says, one day, she says, I was just overwhelmed and just, I guess she was, I don't know, she was just having a bad day. And her father was on his mission in Iowa. So the dad wasn't there. And she says, suddenly I flared up and said to my mom, she says, why do you have to have a baby now when father's in the mission? And there's so much to be done. And she says, as soon as I uttered these words, I realized how thoughtless it was. And she says, I made my mom cry. And then she says, I immediately ran to put my arms around her and ask her to forgive me. But she said, every time I went back, when her folks moved back to Utah, she said, I'd go visit them, and she says she just still felt so bad about what she had said, and she'd just say, Mom, please forgive me. And her mom says, Lizzie, stop worrying about it. I understand why you had that outburst. You just had too many responsibilities for a young girl. And she says, you were the best daughter and mother ever had. And she said, it always made me feel good. In spite of many duties on the farm, there's always time for fun and pleasure. So they did. They'd go for a couple of days up in the canyon, and they would take their fishing lines, and they would go pine nut hunting, and they would sing. She said there's plenty of laughter and singing, horseback riding, corn husking, carpet rags, sewing bees. And she talked about housewarmings, dinners at our neighbors, and basket suppers where the boys bid for our pretty baskets. So I remember that kind of, hearing about it, that, they make these baskets and then they would bid on them. My special chums were Nellie King, Ida Durfee, and Jane Johnson, and Julie Grew. And they sang together. And I guess they were quite the singers, yeah. She goes on and on. She did, when she was married,
Who did she marry?
she married
Okay.
Lewis King. She married Lewis King. So that when she was 11,
Okay.
yeah, she ended up marrying him. And when they got married, they immediately went on a mission to Canada. And I didn't know they had couples back in those days. But those two as a couple went to Canada and were on a mission. And it doesn't really say how long the mission was, but they called me a missionary of labor among the YLMIA. Young ladies.
Mutual improvement district.
Okay. So anyway, she was a missionary too, and they labored in the field. They went on their honeymoon to on their mission. They went to the mission. So. And it talks a lot about their married life in Canada.
So is that why the Kings went up there, was because they
Probably.
Did they stay there?
Yeah, they did.
Stayed there.
Uh-huh.
Was this Cardston? Where'd they go?
They went to Carson.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, see, part of that, the church, was it Brigham Young? Who was president of the church when he asked the saints, a group of saints, he called them to go to Cardston
Mm-hmm.
to make a settlement there. Yeah, was it that who it was? I don't
This would have
remember.
been a lot later than that.
Yeah,
And not only Lou went, but another sister, Ruby, went, and they stayed in Canada.
Yeah.
There's
Mhm.
still Kings that are up in Canada.
Oh,
yeah. So it has some news clippings, and she celebrated her 106th birthday before she passed away, and she was the oldest living person in Canada in 1980, and she celebrated her birthday in Provo, Utah, when she was 106. It says, it's so funny, it talks about her, and it says that even 105, she was still dancing up a storm. Yeah. So in good health and dancing up a storm. So.
Bill Jones.
Anyway, there's a picture of her up there, 106 years old.
And we went to that, Bud and I went to that and saw that.
Oh, did you? Yeah,
Can we pass that picture?
sure. And there's two of those news clipping. It's like they did 100 and then 105 and then it talks about, well, yeah, there's three of those clippings, so you guys want to pass it around. So, number 2, Alonzo Eames. And there wasn't a lot on Alonzo. It said he loved his parents so much that he never did anything cause them a bit of worry. And he was called on a full-time mission, and he was preparing to go on the mission, and when the epidemic of typhoid fever struck Almo, and he was the one that died, and he passed away. She says that Lizzie had sent him $5 to help him on his mission, and it reached the mission home the day he died. So that's
So he died in this
no.
here, or?
He died here. He didn't even get there. Yeah. And it shows he's buried in Almo, and it shows his headstone, and so that's all I know about him. That and it doesn't say when he died. He was born in 1883, and I can't see on the headstone when he died. So that was he passed away on September 7th, 1904. And number 3, Robert Eames, and it said that he took a lot of responsibility on his shoulders because his father was called on a mission, and taking care of horses, cows, pigs, sheep, cultivating, planting, irrigating, stacking hay and grain, and threshing where their burdens were his burdens. And it really doesn't. He just tells he married Betsy Montgomery. So.
And he died. He had a brain tumor and died.
Oh, okay. I don't know if
And
that
he's
says it.
buried in Almo too.
Okay. So did he die when he was pretty young? I don't know.
Mhm, he did.
Okay. So that's Robert and Lucy Eames. And child number 4. She was a sweet brown-eyed girl with a lovable disposition, and she was a super good singer. And she was so small, they had to place that a chair had to be placed by the organ for her to stand on when she sang at different occasions. So I don't know how small she was, but I guess she was tiny. And Lizzie says she remembers singing A Bird in the Gilded Cage. And this Lucy, she said she remembers the Home Sweet Home, the orchard, the 4 rooms, and she said she helped with doing the potatoes and vegetables, and they had a well about 22 feet deep, and we had to heat water on the wood stove for washing, clothing, and bathing. And I remember Daddy telling us stories and singing songs in the cold evenings as we gathered around the heater to listen. And she said that there's one story she told. She had a vivid memory on a cold winter day. She said, when I was about 5 years old, Brother Robbie was 7 and Sister Alice was 3. And Daddy and Mother had hitched up the team and sleigh to go to town, which was about 3 miles away. And they took Ruby the baby with them, and telling us they would be back as soon as they could. And they hadn't been gone only a short time when a terrible snowstorm hit. And I can't imagine them leaving, but they left their house.
The kids did?
Yes, they left the house. And it says first Robbie had us kneel in a circle and prayed the Lord would guide us to Grandma Emma's, which was Emma Eames, which was 1.5 miles away. We put on our coats and hoods and started across the field, and the snow was so deep I couldn't walk in it without Robbie helping me. And he would pick up Alice and carry her a short distance, put her down, and come back for me. So Alice was 3, she was 5, and he was, they made it there. Well, they didn't quite make it there. The Wakes, Robert Wake, from Grape Creek came along with a sleigh, and they gathered them up and took them to the grandparents. But why they left, it doesn't say why they left. I mean, they were in the house. So, I don't know. And then another incident she talked about was she was 13, and Lonnie and Robbie were 17 and 15, and they were plowing a ditch in the field, and some way the plow tipped over, scared the team of horses, and the horses were running through the field with a plow behind them.
Oh dear.
And Mother called, and Mother saw it and called out, "The horses are headed for the barbed wire." And I jerked my bonnet off my head and ran toward them, waving my bonnet. And she said the horses turned and missed the barbed wire fence, but ran towards me, knocking me down. And Mother, she says, and Mother saw and threw her head over her apron and prayed that I would be saved from death. She said I was dragged 15 feet with a plow banging behind, and she said it hit a rock and bounced over me. So she was saved, and she said, she says, I saw my little lamb and grabbed it in my arms and ran into the house, bruising and bleeding, and sand ground into my face and arms. The horses stepped on one of my arms, but no bones were broken. So she was a very lucky little girl. So
She was 13 when that happened.
yeah, yeah. Let's see. And I'm not going to talk about who they met and who they married because that goes on forever. Okay, number 5, Alice Eames. That's my grandma. And she was born in Almo, and she had the typical blonde and fair skin, light hair, and blue eyes. Most of them had the brown eyes. She had the blue eyes. She was quiet and shy and grew to womanhood. She became a tower of strength in the community in which she lived. And she married my grandpa, Asel. And when she was 21, she says, of course, Grandpa Ward was the bishop, and she said she was great help to his calling. And she had 8 kids, and number 8 was my dad, Buddy. And she died when she was 53 years old. So I wasn't born when Grandma, Ward was about that. Anyway, I know, just very little about Grandma, So number 5, and going on to number 6. Number 6. Who's number 6? Ruby. And this was just she just said she fell in love. I came to Canada and fell in love with Wesley Will McMullen, and she they had 5 kids, and they went back to Raymond, Canada, and that's really not much. She didn't really say much about herself either. That's it, other than they loved to sing. She said, my greatest happiness was singing in my dear husband's choir that was conducted for about 10 years in the 1st Ward and also in Twin Falls, Idaho, the 7th Ward in Ogden, Utah. So, okay, that's the 6 kids.
And about 2 years, it was about 2 years before Bud died, her son knocked on our door and introduced himself.
Wow,
And Bud had never ever saw him before.
really? Huh. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I don't know any of my cousins either, so. I know, I'm sorry, I haven't seen him for years, but no.